Hey guys, it's time for a festival edition video. Hanukkah is upon us. For years on this playlist, I didn't do any videos of Hanukkah. And then last year, what I did was I had the opportunity to share with you my son's bar mitzvah presentation, which was on Hanukkah and how he brought the celebration of Hanukkah into our family. So you can go back and find that video from last year. But it's time to do another reflection on Hanukkah. And you know, today's reflection is going to feel somewhat similar to my son's presentation, because the video that I watched in preparation for this, the learning that I did this year for Hanukkah, but like every festival, what I do is I typically, you know this by now, is I run over to Aleph Beta, I grab some teaching or some series that I haven't watched yet. It could be new, it could be old, from Rabbi Fohrman or Imu Shalev, and I watch just some of their thoughts on Aleph Beta. And I don't do that just because I need to make a YouTube video. I do that because every annual year, as I come up to these festivals, I want to be preparing my own heart. I want to be learning. I want to be getting myself ready so that I can lead my family well and all those kinds of things in those spaces. And so I grabbed one of those videos, and this will probably feel similar to last year's conversation, because I think it was one of the videos that my son watched as he was studying and preparing and getting ready for his bar mitzvah presentation. So there are some similar themes, and that's okay. Number one, because it's going to be a little bit different. Number two, because it's okay to learn the same lesson more than once. But there's a video and a teaching about half an hour long from Rabbi Fohrman. I will link it in the description of this video. As always, I would assume that it probably sits behind a membership paywall. But for those of you who are subscribers at Aleph Beta, you'll be able to watch that video. Or if you have like a free, I think they have a free version of their membership. I don't know if they still do. They used to, where you can watch like 10 minutes a week or something like that for free. And so maybe over the next few weeks you could watch the video if you're committed to free access. But I'll put a link to the video because I'm not trying to plagiarize his stuff. His teachings are always about 100 times more in depth. In fact, I just realized the last festival edition video I did on, I think it was a while ago, on Sukkot and the clouds of protection. I got done with that video and I was like, I feel like I missed a bunch of stuff. And so I looked down at my notes, and there were like literally 3 more pages of notes I forgot about. So listen, there is always more stuff, and there's always a much better, more thorough presentation of whatever I share with you over at those links over at Aleph Beta. So you can go watch the real thing over there. But here's the reflection. Fohrman started off his lecture by saying, listen, we can think about some of our holidays, and our holidays often commemorate, the Jewish holidays often commemorate some story that often has like a big miracle, right? And so Fohrman says, I want to play a little game. Let's play a little game where we look at the holidays and we say, is it a big miracle or a small miracle? Big miracle or small miracle? Rabbi Fohrman loves to create little games that help us get engaged with the text. So he says, let's look at Pesach, the story of the Passover, the Exodus story. So you have the story of 10 plagues, God rescuing the whole nation of Israel out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea. Fohrman says, big miracle or small miracle? Obviously, it's a pretty big miracle. It's huge. Historic, big miracle, right? He says, let's take a look at, how about the story of Purim, right? The story of Esther. Like the whole story of Esther and how her and Mordecai work together, and they're pushing against this plot from Haman, and ends up essentially saving the people from this like Holocaust level extermination and genocide, right? Big miracle or small miracle? Big miracle, right? Then he says, we have a story of Hanukkah, and it's a story of, according to the rabbis, according to the Midrash, the Gemara, the celebration of Hanukkah is about the miracle of after the war, they get back into the temple of God, after the Maccabees have defeated the Greeks. And they find one jar of oil, which is should be just enough for like a day. But the jar somehow lasts for 8 days, because it takes a certain amount of time to make oil the way you're supposed to make oil, the way that it's okay, prescribed by Torah to have, and there wasn't going to be enough oil, but the oil lasted for 8 days. And Rabbi Fohrman said, is that a big miracle or a small miracle? It feels like a pretty small miracle, right? She's like, what's up with that? Like, what is it up with the story of Hanukkah? And it's about how this jar of oil lasted for 8 days, 8 days, 8 nights. And he says, and by the way, why are we celebrating the oil, according to the rabbis, and we're not celebrating the war? Because the story of Hanukkah is really about the war, like the Maccabees defeating the Greeks. And we kind of know that that's the story behind the story, but the rabbis don't seem to offer much commentary at all about that. They just talk about the oil and the miracle of the oil. So what are these things that there must be some kind of unifying theme between the war and the oil that might give us an idea of why this is even the miracle? And Fohrman says, not only that, but when you read the rabbis say that it was the next year when they decided that this would be the celebration of Hanukkah. So it's not even the year that the story happens. It's the anniversary of this event. It's the next year where they come out and they say, oh, we need to have a holiday because of what happened last year. Rabbi Fohrman says, why did it take a year? Why did it take a whole year to set this up? Fohrman says, why is the miracle that a year later, the Jews decided to light the candles of Hanukkah? And so, as in typical Fohrman fashion, he says, well, when we think about this story, we think about the fact we've actually seen this story before. That's usually the case. There's a story, but the story's happened before. It's actually calling us back to a story that we already know, that we're already familiar with. He's like, let me ask you this. We have this story of this lampstand, which kind of looks like, if you've ever seen the lampstand, it's branches, like there are these 7 branches, and not just like the concept of branches, but they actually have like petals on it, and like it's designed to look like a branch. So you have this bush, in essence, this golden lampstand, this lampstand that looks like a bush. It's on fire, and it's burning with oil that essentially isn't being consumed. The oil lasts for 8 days. So it's not just consumed on the first day. The oil's not being consumed. And this lampstand that looks like a bush is on fire. And Fohrman goes, well, of course we've heard this story before. It's the story of the burning bush, right? Moses is out there, and he sees this bush on fire, but the bush isn't being consumed, right? Fohrman says, it's almost like, in some ways, the story of the burning bush and the story of Hanukkah, it's almost like they can almost serve as bookends for the people of rabbinical Judaism, right? It's going to be after the destruction of the temple, not long after this, that the Jewish people will form what we know as Talmudic rabbinical Judaism today. So it's almost like the burning bush and this burning bush almost sit on both ends of the story of the Jewish people prior to the destruction of the temple. So he says, so let's go back to the story of the burning bush and see if we can get any wisdom from there. The story's in Exodus 3, if you want to look at it yourself. Exodus 3, first few verses of Exodus 3. We're told that Moses goes to Horeb, also known as Sinai later in the story. We're told that it's the mountain of God. And Fohrman says, why do I need to know that? Like later at Mount Sinai, we'll know that it's the mountain of God. Why do I need to know right now that Moses is at this particular mountain? Like we know, if we've read Torah, we know how the story ends. So we know that this will end up being Sinai. But if we were reading this story for the first time, why would I need to know that it's the mountain? It's like, it doesn't really show up anywhere. Why is this the mountain of God? And why is there all of this extra material, right? So we're told that Moses is in the vicinity of Horeb. He's on the mountain of God. Then we're told he sees a bush that's burning. And he sees that the bush is not being consumed. And then we're told that Moses says to himself, hey, that bush isn't being consumed. I'm going to go over and see why are we told that backstory? Why do we need to know what's going on in his head? And then we're told that God sees that Moses is actually looking and Moses is actually engaged. And then God says, Moshe, Moshe. And then they have the conversation about, I need you to go down to Egypt, blah, blah, blah. Fohrman says, why in those first few verses am I told all of that extra material? Like, the story could have just said, Moses was out watching his sheep in the wilderness, and he saw a burning bush, and he realized that the bush wasn't being consumed. And God spoke out of the bush and said, Moshe, Moshe. Why all the extra? Why do I need to know it's the mountain of God? Why do I need to know what Moses said to himself, like this inner dialogue that really makes no impact on the story? Why do I need to know that God notices and sees Moses? Like, all that stuff feels unnecessary. And so Fohrman says it must not be extra. It must actually be necessary. Fohrman remembers in his video, in the teaching, he says, let's remember who Moses is. Moses is a guy who is born to Hebrew parents, but ends up being raised in Pharaoh's household. Moses is somebody who chooses not just to stay in his palace, but to go out and be amongst the workings of the kingdom. He's a person who chooses, he doesn't have to, he chooses to associate with his own brethren. He knows, on some level, he knows his own story. He knows that his backstory, he's actually a Hebrew. He chooses to associate with the Hebrews when he could just be like, I'm not one of them. I've been raised in Pharaoh's household. But he chooses to associate. He chooses to see the injustice. He doesn't have to see the injustice, but he chooses to. He chooses to do something about the injustice. And we could talk about his methods and whether or not those are righteous methods. His returning violence for violence approach. But he does something. What we know about Moses is he chooses to associate with the people that are on the bottom of the story, and he chooses to care about the injustice and to do something about the injustice. So we know that Moses is the kind of person that God wants to work with. Like we know that God's choosing him for very logical, this makes sense. This is the kind of person that God would want to work with, right? But it's almost like God has one last box he wants to check. He's checked 3 boxes, right? Okay, he's somebody that will associate with the people on the bottom. He's somebody who will see the injustice. He's somebody that's going to need to do something about the injustice. But will he, there's a 4th box. And this burning bush moment seems to be a part of what that is. It's interesting, Fohrman said, because on one hand, you would just expect God to do a more impressive miracle. God kind of does this cheap, low-grade miracle. And if he would have just done a bigger miracle, I'm sure he would have gotten, what God seems to be concerned about is that Moses is going to notice, right? He's like, is Moses going to notice this? Is he going to see me? And you're like, well, God, if you want him to see you, just do a bigger miracle. You're kind of hiding the miracle. You've got this burning bush, but what Moses has to do is Moses has to see that the bush isn't being consumed. He sees a burning bush. Any of us would see that. But how do you notice that the bush isn't being consumed? It's not being burned up, right? How do you have to stare at that for some time, right? So there's an element of time involved. You're not just going to look at this bush for 3 seconds and be like, oh, it's not being consumed. You're going to have to sit there and look at it for 3 minutes at least to be like, hey, that bush isn't burning up. That's weird. So not only is there a time element, but there's a willingness to see what your brain is not naturally going to want to see. Fohrman talks in his teaching about this experiment that they did at some university, where they took a bunch of university students and they basically had a deck of cards. And they showed all these students these deck of cards. And they said, what is this? It's the 3 of spades. It's the 2 of hearts. It's the 6 of clubs, right? It's the Queen of diamonds. And they just had them name cards. And then eventually in the process, they showed them a doctored card. So they showed them the 3 of hearts, but one of the hearts was whited out. Or they showed them the 3 of diamonds, but they changed the 3 to a 2. And what they noticed is the students saw either the number or the amount of items, and they said it was either card, but no student, and they were able to look at these cards for like 5 seconds, 5-6 seconds. No student in the experiment ever said, that card's wrong. So they either saw the 3 or the 2, depending on which part of the card that they focused on or noticed, but their brain did not let them compute that what they were looking at was a card that wasn't in the deck. Like essentially what they were showing them was a 53rd card. Like every deck of cards has 52 cards in it. But there's a 53rd card in this deck, a card that doesn't belong, a card that's not actually in the deck. That's what, like, your brain's not going to want you to see the thing. What is God looking for in Moses? It's one thing that Moses is willing to associate with the person on the bottom of the power pyramid, the oppressed, the marginalized. It's another thing that Moses is going to be able and willing to see the injustice. It's another thing that Moses is going to be able and willing to do something about the injustice. But God is looking for a 4th box. Is Moses going to be willing to see? Will he take not just the time, but also have the discernment to see the divine when it's not going to logically compute? And that's what happens at the burning bush. Moses sees that the bush is not being consumed. This is why we're told that Moses says to himself, that bush is, I'm going to get curious. I'm going to write about this in a book coming up here. Reed and I have a book coming out here in a few months. And my next book writes about this in the chapter. I'm going to get curious and I'm going to go over and see what's going on in this burning bush. And when God sees that Moses doesn't just take the time to notice that something is up, but is willing to open himself up to the fact that something, like God is like, something could be going on here. God could be, there's a hope element. There is a willingness to see the divine, the miracle buried in what looks like normal nothingness. That's when God says, I have the leader that I need on my hand. Fohrman will go on, and I won't spend a lot of time here in this video. Fohrman will go on to say the reason that we're told that it's the mountain of God is because we want to connect this story to Sinai. Sinai was another place where there was fire, not this time in a bush, but on top of the mountain. And the mountain wasn't being consumed, but it was another story of God's presence. This one's not hidden. This one's obvious. But then, if you know the story, Moses goes up, and there's a story of the golden calf, and God says, I'm going to destroy the people. And Moses says, you can't destroy the people. Like, you can't do that. Moses is willing to see not just what's on the surface, but what potentially could be possible. This is what makes him the leader that he's going to be for the Jewish people. And so the story of Hanukkah is a story about a bush that's burning, but it's not being consumed, right? The oil's not being consumed. And the reason that we celebrate the oil and not necessarily the war, the reason that we celebrate the reason that the miracle is that they chose to celebrate the holiday a year later is because it was the people of God willing to see the divine, God at work, in something that would have been easy a year later to just be like, oh yeah, that happened. But they took time and they looked back and they realized, yes, it was not a big miracle. It was a small miracle. And yet this whole story is about how God is at work when it doesn't seem to be that there's anything divine going on here. It wasn't actually that the Maccabees beat the Greeks, right? Hold on to that thought. It wasn't the oil. The oil wasn't being consumed, right? The flames weren't coming from the oil. The flames were coming from God. The victory didn't come from the war. The victory didn't come from the Maccabees. You could think that if you're just watching it on the outside, but they were like, no. The victory came from God. The victory came from the fact that God is at work as we choose to partner with him, as we choose to answer the call. If we choose to be like Moses and be people that identify with those that are in need and see something about the injustice and do something about the injustice, we also have to be people that are willing to see that when it looks like nothing else is going on, something huge is going on. Like when it looks like we have to be able to see the small miracles. We have to be people that take the time and are willing to notice the 53rd card that doesn't belong in the deck. Anyway, loved that reflection. I love that reminder from Hanukkah. As a follower of Jesus, it's so beautifully aligned with the season of Advent and the Christmas story. But I digress. Anyway, take that for what it's worth. I love that reflection. Appreciate all the folks over at Aleph Beta always giving us great things to think about, to learn from the story. And we'll see what's up next before the end of the year gets here. Talk to you soon.